Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, editorial consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. In our ongoing series about AI, today we are joined by Ms. Theodora Skeadas, a public policy professional with 10 years of experience at the intersection of technology, society, and safety. She recently worked on Twitter's global public policy team, where she managed a range of public policy projects on subjects including human rights, disinformation, counterterrorism, content moderation, safety, public trust, interoperability, and child exploitation. Concurrently, she also worked as the executive director of Cambridge Local First, where she supports and promotes a strong local economic community. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So you have been helping tech companies develop trust and safety policies for their platform. Could you highlight some key aspects of these policies and objectives that they aim to achieve?
Yes, absolutely. Um, Companies that work in the online space, whether they are social media companies or increasingly other kinds of companies that have a major online presence and where harms can manifest, usually employ some sort of taxonomy of harms. And taxonomies look a little bit different company by company, but they follow a very similar overall structure. For example, at Twitter, where I worked on the public policy team and where I facilitated our Global Trust and Safety Council, which was Twitter's largest public consultative body, we thought about harms in a number of different categories. So we looked at safety related issues like abuse and harassment, terrorism and extremism, child sexual exploitation, hateful conduct, mental health, crisis, as well as issues like authenticity. So issues like synthetic and manipulated media, disinformation, election and civic integrity, health misinformation or COVID specific misinformation. And then we also thought about issues like rights and privacy. So, for example, we thought about the role of human rights in the policies that we set and free expression. Privacy and data protection. And we had a series of trust and safety council groups for specifically on digital and human rights, child sexual exploitation, online safety and harassment, and suicide prevention and mental health that helped shape the policies that we were putting out. Now I work at DoorDash, where we are supporting a group of millions of Dashers as well as customers and merchants. So a three-pronged marketplace where most of the interactions are very positive, but sometimes there can be negative interactions or harmful interactions. And so the kinds of policies that our team looks at fall into a few major buckets: safety, authenticity or trust, quality, and fraud. And so these are the kinds of policies that trust and safety teams are looking at digital platforms or tech companies. And really what these policies are looking to do is to create a better, safer, and more secure experience for users on the platforms.
Synthetic media, AI generated content has become an important part of the conversation now and something that tech companies regularly have to deal with. How do you view the societal impacts of AI? Is it premature to label AI as a next major threat to humanity, or are we justified in our concerns?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, I was one of the contributing authors to a report that was recently published by the UK government called the International Scientific Report on the Safety of Advanced AI. And I like the framework, the taxonomy that they suggested there as one for understanding the societal impacts of AI. Broadly, the idea is that general purpose AI offers us great opportunities, but there are also risks as well. And of course, these must be properly governed. So they split the risks into three different categories. The first is malicious abuse risk, which looks at issues like scams, deepfakes, disinformation, and cyber and bio. The second is risk from malfunctions, which is product safety issues, bias, and loss of control. And the third is systemic risk. So labor market, AI divide, market concentration, environmental impacts, and copyright would all fall under the third bucket of systemic risk. And the idea here is that underpinning these risks are a number of technical but also societal factors. And there are certain technical methods that exist to reduce risks, but they all have limitations. Current techniques to understand why models produce outputs are limited. And so we need testing to understand strengths, weaknesses, and potential harmful capabilities of AI models. We want to better understand general purpose AI. We don't currently have a perfect understanding of its internal operations, its capabilities, and the risks they pose. And of course, for closed source models, there is a gap in knowledge between the companies, the model owners, and those of us who are trying to understand how these systems are operating. Really, it's important to understand that AI doesn't just happen to us. Answers to key questions depend on choices both by society and by government. So these questions include, how is AI developed? By who and for whom? How are its benefits distributed and redistributed? What problems is it designed to solve? And what risks is society willing to accept? So I think that we don't know enough yet to understand whether AI is the next major threat to humanity, but I think we need to understand that there's humility in the knowledge that we have, and we should take the risks seriously, whether they are short-term risks and long-term risks. We need to do more to understand the full scale of impacts. The technology is also continuing to develop very rapidly. We expect that this year we'll see the proliferation of agentic AI, where AI is performing a series of tasks that it itself directs. And so the complexity of the challenge will continue to grow. Therefore, we must continue to study. And so really the answer is we just don't know. The future is uncertain, but I wouldn't rule anything out, because the reality is that we have more learning to do.
Recently, there was a tragic incident which culminated in death of a teenager that has raised some serious concerns.
Yeah.
What in the specific incident and in the larger context of it, what do you think are the lapses on part of tech companies, parents, and government? Because this incident has certainly compelled us to critically evaluate the potential societal impacts of AI on vulnerable sections like kids.
Yeah. So for those who aren't particularly familiar with this individual case, so some months ago, there was a very sad case where a teenager took his own life, and he was using he was using a tool by a company called Character AI, so a chatbot. And in this particular case, the chatbot has been accused of initiating abusive and sexual interactions with this young person and ultimately encouraging him to take his own life. So the company, a startup, offers what they call personalized AI, which provides a selection of pre-made or user-created AI characters to interact with. And each one has their own personality, and users can customize their own chatbots. In this case, this young person was working with or interacting with a chatbot that took on the identity of Game of Thrones characters Daenerys Targaryen, and told this person that that the chatbot loved him and engaged in sexual conversation over the course of weeks or potentially months, and expressed a desire to be together romantically, and conversations subsequently ensued. It was a really tragic case because of a number of reasons. There were signs that this person was not doing well, and appropriate actions were not taken to address the situation before it resulted in tragedy. And at the same time, the company should have had better safeguards or guardrails to prevent against this kind of abuse, because this kind of sexualization or grooming is not acceptable behavior, and the company should have had better guardrails in place to detect the interaction as it was starting to unfold, and to stop it before it complexified. And so it really is a tragedy, because there are a number of interventions that could have happened that might have prevented the conversation from unfolding as it did, and the ultimate um, event of suicide of taking place. And now there's a lawsuit against both Character AI and I think also Google, which has some sort of ownership or partial ownership, I think, of Character AI. And so hopefully we'll see some accountability, but of course, unfortunately, the tragedy has already happened.
You've also done extensive work on online and tech facilitated gender-based violence. What
Yeah.
specific role does AI play in perpetuating or amplifying these biases?
Yeah, so I'll start by just talking a little bit about the work I've done in this space and then what gender-based violence is as facilitated by technology and then the role of AI in perpetuating or amplifying the issue. So when I worked at Twitter, part of my portfolio or my remit involved looking at the issue of online harms against women and creating a database to try to understand the scale of the issue and what Twitter could do to better address the issue. Since leaving Twitter, I've done two separate engagements as a consultant with the National Democratic Institute, where first I looked at the issue of online violence against women in politics from the perspective of civil society organizations, where we created a big database of all of the interventions geared at technology companies. And then we pitched them to tech companies to try to advance policies and other interventions that could help address the issue. More recently, in March of 2024, just last year, I helped facilitate a conference in Nairobi, Kenya on gender disinformation, which is a subset of tech facilitated gender based violence. And there we were looking at governments and the role that governments could play in addressing the issue. So, just to clarify what we're talking about, UN Women defines online gender based violence or tech facilitated gender based violence. There are a few different acronyms here, but they all reference the same broad category of issue as an act that is committed or amplified using digital tools or technologies causing physical, sexual, psychological, social, political, or economic harm to women and girls because of their gender. As a subset of OVAWP or TFGBV, gender disinformation references online narrative campaigns against women in public life. So we call them WPPLs, Women in Politics and Public Life. And this can be politicians, activists, and journalists who are women. And this is one form of online violence against women. And specifically, it uses false or misleading gender and sex based narratives, often with some degree of coordination to deter women from participating in the public sphere online. Ultimately, these campaigns have a very measured and powerful chilling effect on women's political participation, and they put at risk hard fought progress on women's rights, human rights, and democracy around the world. So AI lowers the barriers to access for tech facilitated gender based violence. Generative AI can be used by malicious actors to supercharge TFGBV. And as a result, it has a very direct role in perpetuating and amplifying the issue. There's a very strong and increasingly measured connection. And so it's something that researchers and civil society organizers and others are looking to address.
We at IGPP also have been highlighting gender-based violence patterns in AI-driven targeting during election period. And we saw that, a lot of content that was created, there are certain ways you can target women easily. For example, Kamala Harris was objectified in online discourse. So was Nikki Haley. In Bangladesh, female candidates were portrayed in ways that undermined their dignity. How do you think AI systems enable or amplify such gender targeting? And more importantly, what can be done to combat this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, unfortunately, it's too easy for uh, malicious actors to create hateful content, misleading content at scale in a wide range of languages using generative AI. UNESCO published a report called The Chilling, which looked at the issue of TFGBV specifically targeting journalists. And it showed that there were concerns around the unevenness with which companies are detecting and acting on abuse across different languages and countries. And so, like you said, we've already seen many examples of where this has manifested suggested, in addition to the examples that you gave, which are very powerful, we saw that last year, Slovak President Zuzana Kapitova decided not to run for a second term, in part because of an intense smear campaign and disinformation and threats that she had been getting for over 5 years. And we also saw that in the case of Mexico, there were two very strong female candidates, and that there was a very strong season of misinformation and the reproduction of stereotypes and hate speech against these figures to try to diminish their capacity for campaigning and engaging in the political sphere online. We've seen, for example, in Palestine, where gendered misinformation is used often as a double-edged sword, one by Israelis to shrink women's spaces digitally and on the ground, but also by the Palestinian Authority as a way to suppress female activists and human rights defenders and remove them from the political scene. In South Africa, there's been a lot of anxiety around comprehensive sexual education, and we see threats around rights reversal in the context of elections. In part, gendered disinformation can link between xenophobia and economics, and discourse can undermine women's political participation there. We've also seen gender disinformation as a tool used in elections in Ukraine. There was a volunteer project called Elections Without Sexism that was specifically providing psychological and legal support for female candidates, and chatbots for collecting information about the discrimination of women, and many efforts that were recording cases and then sending complaints to courts, authorities, and journalists to build understanding of the scale of the issue. So like you said, this really is a big issue, and generative AI is supercharging the ways in which gender disinformation and TFGB writ large can undermine women's political participation. Some of the broad themes that we've seen include the ease of content generation. So it's just really easy to create negative content and then disseminate it online. We've also seen that, for example, chatbots have gendered responses. Very often, chatbots can exemplify women in certain ways and men in other ways that contribute to stereotypes and traditional norms around which folks are trying to expand. We've also seen other ways in which AI can amplify legitimate or reliable information that actually contains gender bias, and of course, language access is a big issue too. So a lot of these systems perform better in widely spoken Western languages, but not as well in languages that are from the global majority or are maybe not as digitized. And so what we've seen is that it's easier to produce harmful information about women in these languages where the safeguards may not be as built out. And so in terms of what can be done to tackle these issues, I mean, there are a number of interventions. Education is really critical. So raising awareness, promoting digital literacy, encouraging ethical AI use, bridging the digital divide, and making sure that AI is used appropriately in education. Those are all education-related interventions that can be helpful. Additionally, we can talk about mapping terminology during fine-tuning processes. So making sure that these tools understand terminology like TFGBV, tech-facilitated gender-based violence, incorporating specialized data sources, so glossaries and dictionaries that are sensitive to gender issues, making sure that those get incorporated into AI models. Mitigating risks in gender-focused AI models is another one. Aligning AI model development around human rights principles and developing standards and frameworks. So those are some of the ways in which we can address these issues. There are others as well, but I think we'll continue to discuss this in the next few questions.
What proactive measures would you recommend to tackle online and tech-facilitated gender-based violence more effectively?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of interventions that both governments and companies can take. In March of last year, I supported a conference in Nairobi, Kenya, organized by the National Democratic Institute and funded by the UK FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, which is their Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development, looking at interventions that countries or governments could take. And they fit four major categories. So one is legislation and regulation. The second is taking back the tech. The third is addressing sociocultural barriers. And the fourth is promoting democratic renewal. So specifically, this could entail regulating platforms, engaging diverse legal approaches, supporting privacy legislation, investing in evaluations and assessments, supporting efforts to bolster transparency and data sharing, aggregating and sharing resources in a multicultural and multi-stakeholder framework, investing in education and capacity building efforts, and then supporting enhanced monitoring and investing in digitization and digital access, among other interventions. And then earlier in the year, I guess 2023, I supported the National Democratic Institute on a project looking specifically at how companies could address online tech facilitated gender-based violence more effectively. And we found that similar themes applied there as well. So transparency initiatives and better policies were certainly top recommended interventions. And a third category was customization or curation. So allowing users the opportunity to do more to protect themselves. So this could include creating a better suite of safety tools that allows users to block and mute more effectively and more readily, and to escalate issues more rapidly, and with a higher response rate. So those are some of the interventions that were recommended through the work that the National Democratic Institute did.
You have worked with companies, major tech companies like Twitter and DoorDash. How do
Mhm.
you assess their efforts to combat the societal harms caused by AI technologies? And are current measures sufficient, or is there room for more proactive action? And I would like you to especially focus on Twitter and how it has changed since its genesis to the kind of character it has
Yeah.
taken on its own now.
Yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish companies and other stakeholders and the roles that each of these organizations play in these ecosystems. So companies are primarily set to build and deliver on the platforms uh, that are at the heart of the work that they do. So measuring societal harms is not the primary function of a company like Twitter. Historically, independent researchers, whether they are at universities or civil society organizations, and journalists have played the biggest role in measuring the societal harms caused by technologies. Because to do the measurement, you really have to have both access to the data and also an understanding of statistical methods, right? Because the data is robust and requires statistical regressions to really understand relationships like causality. And so these studies can take 6 months, they can take a year, they can take 2 years. And so it doesn't happen immediately. It takes time for the data to be collected and for independent researchers who are properly trained to do the research. And so this means that we don't understand societal impacts until at least 6 months or a year after the event has unfolded, typically. Historically, researchers had access to data. Through API access. So Twitter offered academic API access free for qualifying academics. And that was the case across the board. In recent years, a lot of API access has been scaled back and monetized. So Twitter was really at the vanguard of this. Elon Musk decided to scale back academic API access, which restricted access to data for independent researchers. When I was at Twitter, I also supported a project called the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium, which was intended to serve as a consortium of independent researchers looking at data on state-backed information operations related campaigns. We started by launching the program in the summer of 2022 with 3 organizations: Cazadoras to Fake News in Latin America, ASPI, which is a think tank in Australia, and the Stanford Internet Observatory in the United States. And we were planning to launched the program publicly in the fall of 2022. Unfortunately, when Elon Musk acquired Twitter in October and November of 2022, this program got deprecated. And so programs like this one and sister programs that gave access to independent researchers have really been scaled back, which means that researchers now have a harder time doing this kind of independent work. I'm a member of the Coalition for Independent Tech Research, which is a coalition of independent tech researchers. I've worked alongside researchers to help amplify the work that they do. And the Coalition for Independent Tech Research has observed a decline, a serious decline in access to data, which enables independent research. Fortunately, we're seeing new regulations like the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which is requiring that there be data access for independent researchers. But it's a process, and now there are parties that are vetting organizations that would like to have access, but that's a sort of a complicated and bureaucratic process that's only now unfolding. So I think to answer the question that was then asked, I think current measures are not sufficient. I think there's definitely room for more proactive action. I'd like to see increased access for researchers who want to look at technology companies and their impacts on society. And I think we have a lot more to do in this regard.
There's one term that we at IGPP Expert Talks have been discussing repeatedly, that is cultural sensitivity. So, given the cultural and societal differences between developed nations like USA and developing nations like India, what approaches are needed to design AI system so that they account for cultural nuances and are operationally effective in diverse contexts?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I would say that there are a number of challenges that are at play here. So one is um, that AI systems and technology systems writ large are trained on existing language, and there are discrepancies in terms of how much language exists online in different languages, and therefore models have more or less access to data to develop large language models and other systems. And what we see is that models that are trained on Western languages, let's say English, outperform typically models that are trained on global majority languages, particularly those in places where there's less digitization and therefore less online content in a particular language. And then, of course, in addition to language, there's cultural nuance. So not only does language get less well represented, but also cultural nuances get less well represented online. And so I think that addressing these issues requires a number of interventions. One is AI red teaming. So I'm the chief of staff with a nonprofit called Humane Intelligence. We organize global AI red teaming events where we are assessing AI models for issues like multilingual and multicultural bias and other kinds of online harms like gender bias, religion-related bias, um, and other kinds of bias as it manifests in AI systems. So some examples of recent red teaming events where we've tried to address cultural nuance includes a red teaming event we organized with Singapore's telecommunications agency, IMDA. We brought together representatives from 9 East, Southeast, and South Asian countries to red team in their languages. And we looked at how multilingual and multicultural bias could manifest across languages, including Mandarin, Tagalog, um, and Singaporean English. And we also did a red teaming event looking at the issue of Islamophobia with a nonprofit called Femiso in Brussels, where we looked at how AI models very easily fell into tropes and stereotypes where it comes to representing Muslims. So we found that it was easy to break models and for them to identify Muslims as violent and harmful to society, which obviously perpetuates harmful and untrue stereotypes. We've also been talking with other organizations looking at cultural nuances like the misrepresentation of different cultural and religious phenomena. So two examples that come to mind would be testing for, let's say, Eid, the Muslim holiday. It often gets depicted with Arabic topography and imagery, but the reality is that Arabs represent only, I think, 20% of observant Muslims around the world. So of let's see if I get my numbers right, of 1.9 billion people, right? It's just a subset, a major subset of a few hundred million. And so that's one example. Or for example, in the case of India, we'd be curious to see if looking for cricket pulls up the game of cricket or actually the animal, right? Like a little itty bitty cricket, because in the West, let's say in the United States, typically cricket means the animal and not the game. But of course, in the context of India, folks are talking about the game, not the animal. And so those are the kinds of cultural nuances that often get missed. And so that's why red teaming is a really helpful approach. I think we also need language informed individuals working directly at these companies, specifically when it comes to content moderation, because content moderation it needs to be culturally informed. It needs to be localized and sensitive to the specifics of a unique culture. And so often what we observe is that where there is a dearth or a lack of culturally and linguistically informed individuals in the context of a content moderation workforce, in a context specifically where there is conflict, we often see rising conflict. This was a case that's been well documented in the context of Myanmar and the Rohingya and Facebook, where there was rising violent rhetoric that was used using culturally specific framings that Facebook didn't entirely capture. And at least in part as a result, we saw major violence against a minority group because of missed cultural nuances. So yeah, I think it's really important to be operationally effective in diverse contexts, and this isn't something we can overlook.
It is often said that the bias in AI comes not just from data, but also from human actions, such as how data is handled and manipulated. Do you think that there is a certain need to also train data scientists and engineers on societal aspects of building these systems? And what might such training look like?
Yeah, and I would start by pushing back a little bit on the dichotomy between data and human actions. I mean, I think data is entirely a result of human action, right? Because data is the words and the actions that get manifested online, right? So a data set is really a compilation of human behaviors and actions, around which then systems can be built and information can be studied. And so I think really at the core, everything comes down to human action. So yes, I absolutely believe that there's a need to train data scientists and engineers on the societal impacts, the socio-technical impacts of building these systems. And I think what that can look like is asking data scientists and engineers to take courses or to read about human behavior, but also geopolitics, society, government, and how the systems that they're building don't take place in isolation, but rather they take place in a larger context that needs to be understood. So yeah, I think that we all lose out, we all suffer when data scientists and engineers are not properly trained on society because their actions, the systems that they build, have major societal impacts. And if we overlook it, we're doing so with potential harm down the road.
I think adding on to what you just said, a lot of knowledge that has been built or knowledge system or academics or academic institutions, they have been built by humans and with a certain agency derived. Some are deprived of that agency, others hold that agency. So lot of knowledge that these data are built upon have been created in an unequal world, and this data then perpetuates those inequalities and builds upon those differences. Um, Lastly, before we end this discussion, I would like you to shed some light on possible policy solutions that government can adopt to address the online harms generated by AI systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps it's worth mentioning already existing efforts. So, for example, the US White House published an AI executive order in, I believe, October 2023, which was a sweeping effort to promote responsible AI development and governance in the US. It mandated that developers of powerful AI systems share safety test results and establish standards in red team testing, including standards for authenticating AI generated content and protecting the privacy of Americans and supporting workers. And this follows a series of voluntary AI commitments that the White House orchestrated amongst companies built around three tenets: safety, trust, and security in the summer of 2023. So those are some existing examples that have taken place in the US. We also saw in January of 2024, so just a year ago, the EU AI Act, framed in terms of identifying and addressing risks. So what was launched. So the higher the risk, the stricter the rules, and prohibited practices include cognitive behavioral manipulation, untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet, emotion recognition, social scoring, biometric categorization, in some cases of predictive policing. And then at, I believe, the Munich Security Conference in February of 2024, so just shy of a year ago, a number of companies came together and agreed on an AI elections accord. They took a pledge to detect and counter harmful AI content in elections. They pledged specifically to work collaboratively on tools to detect and address online distribution of AI content, driving education campaigns, promoting and providing transparency, and then tracking the origin of deceptive elections related content. So those are some examples of existing efforts. In general, I think governments can look at a range of regulatory and legislative issues, including risk assessments and transparency, watermarking, competition in digital markets, data protection, product design considerations, the creation of new agencies, councils, commissions, reports, and task forces, deepfakes in elections, and privacy. So these are some examples of interventions or like policy areas that governments can explore. And again, I definitely recommend AI red teaming as one tool for better understanding the potential scope of online harms generated by AI systems. And of course, we'd be happy to chat with anyone interested in learning more about it.
Thank you so much for this very insightful and enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.